Mado, thank you for a very kind introduction. Thank you all for taking time out of what I'm sure is a busy day and a busy semester to come together here today. I really appreciate it very much. And it's nice to be back in Berkeley, which still feels something like home after so many years. It's nice to come back. So I'm going to start today actually by recommending a book, not one that I wrote, which, as far as I'm concerned, Paul snagged the best title of the decade, if not the century. Paul Chet Smith is a curator and cultural critic. He works for the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. This is a really fabulous collection of essays, very erudite, very well-read, fiercely funny, very intellectual. And I knew that Paul had snagged the best title of the decade when I saw this book on the shelf in a bookstore in the airport in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I thought, oh my God, I know an Indian whose book ended up in an airport bookshop. And it's not Louise Erdrich or Sherman Alexie. That's so cool. Because let's face it, most of us who are native scholars, our books do not end up in the airport bookstores. We're lucky if they end up in university bookstores, which are still remarkably peopled by New Age stuff. And the reason most of our scholarly books don't show up in airport bookstores is because we don't follow the rules for how you write about Indians. And just in case you are interested in the rules, this is from Paul's book. He poses a question: why are Indians so often overlooked, misunderstood, misrepresented? In short, why does the news media have so much trouble with us? The answer is best provided by one person, one of the 20th century's greatest philosophers, a man who speaks truth to power and who commands the attention of millions. As I'm sure you have guessed, I am, of course, speaking of legendary television producer Don Hewitt, the genius behind 60 Minutes, who once explained how he managed to keep the show, 60 Minutes, at the top of the ratings decade after decade. He had rules. One of them was to avoid, at all costs, doing stories about Indians. Why? Don Hewitt now. Because Indians talk too much, too slowly, and what they say is always complicated. With Indians, it's never just water. It has to be springs of life bestowed upon us by our grandmothers. Why did Hewitt avoid Indian stories? Because we're lousy television. Hewitt realized the Indian experience is an ocean of terrifying complexity. So, my goal today in a nutshell is to provide a little teensy glimpse of the ocean of terrifying complexity and asking these questions: what does U.S. citizenship mean to American Indians? And what do American Indian citizens mean to the nation? So many people recognize that U.S. citizenship is an interesting and fraught arena. Actually, this picture has nothing to do with this talk, but I was in Google Images looking for that other one about fighting terrorism since 1492, because that appeared on a T-shirt too. So I did this Google Images thing for Indians on T-shirts, and I got this one, and I just had to include it. You can't pass that up. Anyway. That's my only digression. There will be no more. So U.S. citizenship is a fraught and complicated issue. Lots of questions. Who is? Who isn't? Who might be? Who shouldn't be? Who's scary? Who's safe? Who do we welcome? Who do we not? So where do we begin? I'm not going to begin in 1492. I'm not even going to begin in 1620. That's much too long ago. Remember, don't talk too long. I'm going to start in 1924 because I am, after all, a historian. And in 1924, the U.S. Congress passed the American Indian Citizenship Act, which granted birthright citizenship to all American Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States of America. And then we're going to end not really with a date, and not really with answers either, which I also realize breaks rules of what university professors are supposed to provide when we stand in front of a room, but that's just too bad. But we're going to end in a little back and forth between today, 2015, and 1924, because this is a story about history, and that means it's a story about now as well. But I am a historian, so before we get to 1924, we need to have a few moments of historical review, right, to get us up to speed. 10 seconds. You ready? This is going to go fast. You have to pay attention. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now you have 3 seconds to read all those things. Christianity, English only, short hair order, decent families, individuality, nice homes, citizen dress, modern agriculture, self-sufficiency, and lace curtains. Right there. Got it? Okay. That brings us to this. All of that's pretty much about achieving this, at least in theory, at least so the story goes. Native people, boarding schools, all of that, we want assimilation. What does that mean? Land in Indian country is always about land. Private property, not communal ownership, not tribal property. And identity, individualism, not tribal identity. So that, the story goes, the dominant historical narrative, as they say, is what assimilation is all about. So here we are, 1924. U.S. Congress passes this act. And this is the act in its entirety. This is the whole 9 yards. All non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits hereby declared to be citizens. Colon, and then it keeps going. Provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal property. And it's like, what? Decades of assimilationist policy and practice finally reaches its culmination in the be-all and the end-all, hallelujah, U.S. citizenship for American Indians, and Congress preserves tribal property? This makes no sense. Which means we cannot take the rhetoric of assimilationism at face value. There's something else going on there. So when I finally, I'm embarrassed to say, only a few years ago actually finally read this act and read that final sentence and went, huh? This requires further investigation. So then I started poking around, well, what else is going on in the 19-teens and 1920s leading up to what's the discussion around citizenship for Native people? And very quickly you realize, well, at the point that Congress passed the act, there were already 3 Supreme Court decisions. U.S. v. Sandoval in 1913, which said, when it comes to Indians, citizenship is not in itself an obstacle to the exercise of power by Congress, which is taking care of protecting tribal Indians who are, after all, a dependent people. 1915, they make it a little more explicit. Well, of course, when Indians are prepared to exercise the privileges, the tribal relation might be dissolved. Guardianship, this fabulous fictive category created by John Marshall in 1830. Guardianship will come to an end, but it rests with Congress to decide when and how that's going to happen, and whether emancipation will be complete or not. And so then they just nail it to the wall, right? Citizenship for Indians is not incompatible with continued guardianship. So this is about power. It's about the power of Congress. Specifically, it's about general powers more generally to control Native lives and resources and land. Remember, it's always about land. And the capacity, or really incapacity, the assumption of this system, of Native people as eternally dependent, eternally and perseveringly incompetent, and artifacts of the past. So what does that mean now for us today in 2015? Now we get to the technologically challenging part of today's presentation. So bear with me for a minute here, because we're trying to get to a video clip. Oh, and how do I unmute it? Because they need to hear it, right? Technical assistance. Thank you.
What is a redskin? A redskin is a football player. Redskins are fans. The Washington Redskins fan base represents honor, represents respect, represents pride, hopefully winning.
In his first extensive interview about his team's controversial name, Washington Redskins owner Dan Snyder, flanked by his wife Tanya, sat down with Outside the Lines during the team's training camp in Richmond, Virginia. Why do you think it is that some people consider this a slur, and why does Webster's Dictionary define this as a word that's disparaging to Native Americans?
You know, I think you're going to have some people that feel a certain way. Absolutely, we respect those opinions. But I hope they respect our opinion. The respect needs to be mutual, and I hope they do.
What led you to want to do this today?
And his answer is, I didn't want to do this today. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, there he goes. Thank you, Dan. You should have gone with your instincts. Okay, now then. So there's Dan Snyder, owner of the Washington Redskins, expressing this really rather extraordinary sense of entitlement, of possession, of a certain definition of Native being and identity in the world. And in fact, expressing, I think, the even further sense of entitlement of they're not respecting my position, as if the debate is really about one person's opinion versus another's. It is at Ashiawan, which is the Pueblo Museum and Tribal Cultural Center of the Zuni Pueblo in northwestern New Mexico. And this is a post from August 10th of last year by Jim Enote, who is the director of the museum. And he recounts this story from the November past, which would have been 2013, right, about how one day Dan Snyder and representatives from the Redskins appear on his doorstep at the Zuni Tribal Cultural Center and Museum. And how he walks Snyder to his car, puts pleased with the mascot and team name, and gets this rather rude response from Dan Snyder. Now, if you're wondering why Jim Enote is feeling motivated to post this to Facebook on August 10th, 2014, here's why. Let's see if I can find the right link here. Well, we've lost it somehow. Okay, I'm just going to tell you what it is. On August 11th, 2014, the foundation established by Dan Snyder was visiting Zuni Pueblo. And the Tribal Council had posted on their webpage a call for all Zuni artists to tomorrow, August 11th, noon to 5, come to the government center. Representatives from the Redskins are going to be here, and they're going to be buying jewelry, arts and crafts, and so on. And they're particularly interested in anything that includes the representation, the icon of the Redskins team, and anything that's in the team colors, burgundy and gold. And so Jim Enote posts and questions the integrity of this foundation that Snyder has established and raises the question of the importance of the mascot. It provokes then, and those of you who are interested can go to the Facebook page and follow the commentary, provokes quite a spirited back and forth between Zuni Pueblo community members about the propriety of mascots, about the propriety of the foundation, postings from artists who are saying, look, I'm just trying to feed my family. I really don't appreciate being vilified as someone who's simply trying to feed my family and pursuing markets as they appear. So quite an interesting conversation. Now, one of the things I want to point out is this is not just a difference of opinion. It's not just Dan Snyder, rich white guy who happens to be a jerk. There's a significant difference of scale and structured power relations here that we really have to attend to. And one of the things I think it's important to look at, this is the Pueblo of Zuni homepage, is just how much any given tribal government has on their plate, the things that they are responsible for every day of the week. Government, courts, elections, tourism, animal ordinance, letter from tribal council, the census update, tribal enterprises, which include the museum and cultural center, the home health care agency. And I don't know how to use this. There we go. Rental enterprise, cultural resources, Zuni Skies Unlimited, which is an agent for Cellular One, so telecom communications. Education, health services, running businesses. Tribal governments do it all in ways that municipal governments and state governments, the U.S. has a very different system of scale. There's lots of people and lots of organizations, public and private sectors, that handle all the disparate parts of life that tribal governments are pretty much trying to tackle. So when Dan Snyder and Redskins, Inc. leave Washington, D.C., the gears of government do not, by and large, grind to a halt. I mean, assuming that they're moving in any direction anyway, but, you know, they don't care. Congress keeps going whether Dan Snyder's in town or not. But when Redskins, Inc. descend on Zuni for a day and turn a community against itself, we're talking about impacts that are not trivial. Now then, back to the slideshow. Oh, this is the roster of really quite accomplished professionals who were part of the team, including the sole native person, Henry Rowe. And they, among other things, held what they called councils. Not at every jurisdiction they went to. Long story short, I've been able to find field notes from a number of these people in the last couple of years, and it appears that they held these councils in these particular sites. And so what I've been doing is I've been looking at their field notes, the transcripts from those council meetings where they said to Indian people, you know, we're here to find out what's going on. Tell us what's on your mind. Tell us what you're concerned about. And then I've been going back to agency records to find out more about the people involved. So this survey team produced a report in 1928, The Problem of Indian Administration, which many of you in Indian studies may have heard of as the Merriam Report, which everyone has cited and very few people have read, all 878 pages of it, one of the things that the Merriam Report is really well known for is their excoriating critique of the federal Indian school system, particularly boarding schools, which is where I first encountered this document and the reason I read it. So when I discovered these field notes of the councils, I thought, oh, golly, this is going to be really interesting. I bet there's going to be a lot of commentary in there about boarding schools. No, not. What people are concerned about, and I can't show you all of it, I've just brought a few examples because we have a really full transcript from this particular meeting that was held at Klamath. What people were concerned about was the status as wards and the processes of federal guardianship. So this is, remember, 3 years after Congress passed the American Indian Citizenship Act. And the effects of what Native people had hoped for, which was that U.S. citizenship, and I think this is what people are looking for at the time, based on these transcripts, they saw the possibility of citizenship as a way out from under the crushing, oppressive stranglehold of federal powers on reservations. Control of lands, control of resources, control of education, control of money, control of individual Indian money accounts. If you had a bank account as an Indian person, you couldn't access it yourself without approval of your agency superintendent. Stripping of assets and resources from reservation. These are the things that people are talking about. Council after council after council is, we're supposed to be citizens now. Why is it that we have no say? So that call for a voice, that call for a say, that call for decision-making, what we now call self-determination, as a power, as an expression of the inherent powers of sovereignty. That's what people were talking about to the survey team. So just some examples. Indians have no credit. Policy is out of date. We are, however, burdened with taxation. We're denied a voice in managing our inherited estates. No appeal to the courts for protection. A full citizen who cannot manage his own affairs. Constant critique that affairs here are not well managed for Indians. And given the time frame, many references to the levels of enrollment in service during World War I. Of course, that had been a major part of the public discourses that led up to the ICA in 1924. In fact, Congress had first passed an act a few years earlier that granted citizenship to honorably discharged veterans of World War I. That later is expanded to everybody. So that's an important piece of this. Indians were to be educated and become self-supporting. That's our ambition, and we've complied with the law. What next is what gets me. Our homes are better than those surrounding the reservation, but we are still held as wards. And then what's interesting at Klamath is they go into quite considerable detail about the precise mechanisms of federal mismanagement of their major asset, timber. And there's actually quite an extensive back and forth with members of the survey team who are infuriatingly clueless about and absolutely unwilling to admit that the feds might be mismanaging something. But Klamath people really lay it on the line for them. They actually make comparisons with private industry and Weyerhaeuser and talk about length of contracts, percentages paid, how many years you can sign up for, holding fire insurance, and conclude with, we want to exercise power of choice. Wouldn't you rather make your own mistakes? To which the survey team ag guy says, oh, no, of course not. I'd rather have Congress look after me. And Mr. Frank Bethune in 1927 attends the council at Crow Agency to say, if I told you all I could, I would talk till the sun goes down and comes up the next day, and you would get tired, so I will stop. Now, here's an Indian that Don Hewitt would have appreciated on 60 Minutes. Of course, we don't know how slowly he said that. So, 1927 to 2015, I can't do that math, but it's 80-something years. I think what's important about this story about history is understanding the context of the discourse and what did and did not happen after the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. What did not happen was any compromise of federal powers. What did not happen was an end to federal guardianship. What did not happen was an end to federal fiscal mismanagement, and the Cobell case has nailed that evidence to the wall in recent years. What has continued is paternalism, a sense of quite straightforward, I would say, ownership of jurisdiction over native lands, native peoples, native identity. That's a historical legacy then that I think fleshes out and gives us a foundation to understand Dan Snyder's sense of entitlement. He's not simply some white guy who's kind of a jerk. He has this sense of entitlement, of ownership to the notion of his definition of redskin demanding as much respect as anybody else's definition of redskin in the world, whatever Webster's dictionary might say to the contrary. And he's not alone. I mean, think about Donald Trump being called to testify before Congress when Congress is considering passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Why does Donald Trump get to testify before Congress? And then he's all, oh my God, Indians, they have special rights. This is unconstitutional. It's called competition in the economic marketplace. I thought capitalism was like about that. Not, as it turns out, when it's Indians getting rich. So I think these things are actually tied together in some interesting ways, and this is where my next book is going, so I'll conclude here. I think the sense of entitlement is fundamentally about land. It's about national claims to the actual territory that the U.S. is based on. How do you continually and perseveringly over time maintain a sense of justified claims to land? I think what that requires is an ongoing, demonstrated incapacity of Native people, that we live forever in the past, that we're poverty-stricken, because economic success in the U.S. is a real marker of civilization and entitlement. For Indians to become rich, and I think this is where gaming has highlighted this, for Indians to become rich is like really threatening to people. Poverty, communal holdings of land. So I think perversely enough, that assimilationist project, it accomplished a lot. And then at the moment, Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, when we're conceivably on the cusp of native lands in native hands disappearing, Indian Reorganization Act comes along at a point where most land has successfully been transferred to non-native hands and preserves an ongoing remnant, which has been vastly important to Native people. We wouldn't want all that to go away, but I do think it's served a larger purpose here. Because in that discourse, poverty, communal property, these are important markers of a certain kind of Indianness that I think it suits the U.S. to keep around as an ongoing reminder that those massive transfers of land really were justified. It really does underpin the identity of a nation, a civilized nation. That's a complex argument in a bit of a nutshell, and I don't want you to get tired, so I will stop.